For 10 long years, the walls of Troy stood defiant, an impenetrable fortress that had withstood the might of Greece's greatest warriors. Then, from the shadows of war, a plan was born, devised by one man, the cunning Odysseus. A wooden horse, seemingly an offering of surrender, was left at Troy's gates, but within, Greek warriors lay hidden. That night, the Trojans celebrated their false victory, dragging the horse inside. As they slept, the Greeks emerged, and Troy fell to flame and sword. The war was over. But for Odysseus, the true battle was only beginning. Victorious yet weary, Odysseus longed to return to Ithaca, where his wife, Penelope, and his son, Telemachus, awaited him. With his fleet gathered, he set sail across the Aegean, ready for the journey home. Yet fate, guided by the wrathful sea god Poseidon, had other plans. What should have been a short voyage became a decade-long odyssey, a trial of endurance, wits, and sheer will. This is his story. As Odysseus and his men departed the ruined shores of Troy, they first landed on the windswept coast of Ismarus, home of the Ciconians. Their brief victory turned to disaster when the Ciconians, reinforced by their allies, counterattacked with brutal force. Many of Odysseus's men were slain before they could retreat to their ships. Battered and grieving, the fleet sailed on, but their misfortunes had only begun. A sudden storm conjured by Poseidon himself sent them spiraling off course. For days, they were at the mercy of the waves until, at last, they found themselves drifting into unfamiliar waters. Land appeared on the horizon, lush and inviting. Desperate for food and fresh water, they stepped ashore. It was the land of the Lotus-Eaters. The island's people were welcoming, offering them fruit from the lotus tree. But this was no ordinary fruit. It was enchanted, sapping the will of those who ate it. One by one, Odysseus's men succumbed, their memories of Ithaca fading. They laughed, content to remain forever in blissful ignorance. Realizing the danger, Odysseus fought against time, dragging his men back to the ships, their limbs heavy and unwilling. With the last of them secured, he ordered the sails raised, escaping before the island's spell could claim them all. Once more, the fleet was adrift. This time, they found themselves on a rocky island, scattered with caves and wild goats. Seeking provisions, Odysseus and a select few ventured inland, discovering a massive cavern stocked with food and fresh milk. They helped themselves, unaware that they were trespassing in the home of a giant. As night fell, Polyphemus, a towering Cyclops and son of Poseidon, returned. With a single, monstrous hand, he rolled a boulder across the cave's entrance, sealing them inside. Then, without hesitation, he seized 2 of Odysseus's men, crushed them against the stone floor, and devoured them whole. Trapped and horrified, Odysseus knew brute force was useless. Instead, he turned to guile. He offered the Cyclops a skin of potent wine, and as the giant drank, his rage softened into drunken stupor. When Polyphemus asked for his name, Odysseus simply replied, "Nobody." As the giant collapsed in a stupor, Odysseus and his men seized a sharpened stake and drove it into Polyphemus's single eye. The beast bellowed in agony, calling for help from his kin. But when the other Cyclopes asked who was hurting him, his cries echoed through the night. "Nobody is killing me, nobody." Blinded and confused, the other Cyclopes left him to his fate. At dawn, Polyphemus moved the boulder to let his sheep out. Odysseus and his men clung beneath the animals' bellies, slipping past the blind giant undetected. But as their ship pushed away from shore, Odysseus, unable to resist a final boast, revealed his true name. Enraged, Polyphemus called upon his father, Poseidon, cursing Odysseus to wander the seas for years, never to return home easily. After months lost at sea, the crew stumbled upon Aea, the island of the enchantress Circe. Weary and desperate, they sent a scouting party to seek aid. Circe, stunningly beautiful and seemingly hospitable, welcomed them into her grand hall. She offered them a feast and fine wine, but there was more to it than mere hospitality. These men, hungry and greedy, had looked upon her treasures with covetous eyes. She saw into their hearts. With a wave of her hand, she revealed their true nature, turning them into swine. One man, resisting the meal, fled back to Odysseus and told him of their fate. As Odysseus prepared to confront Circe, the god Hermes appeared. As his great-grandfather, Hermes knew Odysseus's fate was entwined with the gods. He gifted him a rare herb, moly, that would shield him from Circe's magic. Odysseus entered her hall and ate her food, unaffected. When Circe attempted to bewitch him, he drew his sword. Impressed by his resistance, she restored his men to human form and in time fell in love with him. For a year, Odysseus remained with Circe until his longing for home became unbearable. During this time, Circe bore Odysseus a son, Telegonus, who would later play a tragic role in his father's fate. But for now, Odysseus's heart remained set on Ithaca. After escaping Circe's island, Odysseus prepared for his most perilous task yet, a descent into the underworld. Circe had warned him that only the blind prophet Tiresias could reveal the path home. Sailing to the edge of the world, Odysseus and his men arrived in the land of the Cimmerians, a mist-covered realm where the entrance to Hades lay hidden. There, they performed the sacred rites, digging a trench and offering honey, milk, and the blood of a black ram. As the blood seeped into the earth, spirits emerged from the darkness, drawn to the scent of sacrifice. The first among them was Elpenor, a fallen crewman who had died on Circe's island. He begged Odysseus for a proper burial, lest his soul remain lost. Odysseus vowed to honor his request before continuing. Then Tiresias appeared, his sightless eyes glowing with knowledge. He warned of Poseidon's wrath, of the trials still ahead, and of Helios' sacred cattle. No matter what, do not allow your men to harm them, the prophet urged. If they do, only you will survive, cursed to wander for years before reaching Ithaca. As the vision faded, another figure emerged, his mother, Anticlea. Overcome with sorrow, Odysseus reached for her, but his hands passed through her like mist. She spoke of Penelope's faithfulness, Telemachus' growth, and her own death from grief. Tears streamed down Odysseus' face, but he could not stay. Then came the shades of fallen warriors. Agamemnon, betrayed and murdered, warned Odysseus to beware treachery at home. Achilles, once the mightiest of heroes, lamented the emptiness of death. "I would rather serve as a living slave than rule among the dead," he declared. Finally, Odysseus witnessed the damned, Sisyphus, forever rolling his boulder, and Tantalus, tormented by unreachable water and fruit. The horrors of Hades were a stark reminder of divine punishment. Having learned all he could, Odysseus fled the underworld, the weight of prophecy heavy upon him, knowing that his greatest trials still lay ahead. Leaving the underworld behind, Odysseus and his men set sail, their minds weighed down by Tiresias' warnings. The seer had spoken of many dangers, but the first lay just beyond the horizon, the island of the Sirens. The Sirens were no ordinary women. They were cursed beings, their haunting voices imbued with irresistible magic. Their song promised knowledge and secrets forbidden to mortals, calling to sailors with an allure so powerful that no man had ever escaped its grasp. Drawn by their voices, ships would steer themselves toward jagged rocks, dashing against the shore. But Odysseus was determined to hear what no mortal had survived. Recalling Circe's warning, he ordered his men to press beeswax into their ears, sealing themselves off from the deadly melody. For himself, he had a different plan, one that would allow him to experience the siren's call without succumbing to it. His men lashed him tightly to the mast, binding him in place before they took up their oars. As they passed the island, the air shimmered with song. It was unlike anything Odysseus had ever heard, a melody of unearthly beauty, both sorrowful and intoxicating. Odysseus fought against his restraints, his body straining as he screamed for his men to release him, his voice raw with longing. But they could not hear him. Deaf to his pleas, deaf to the deadly song, they rode on. The Sirens, realizing their song had failed, let out a final, mournful wail before vanishing into the mist. The spell was broken. As soon as they were clear of the island, Odysseus' men untied him. He collapsed onto the deck. He had survived what no man had before, yet the Sirens themselves were not so fortunate. Bound by an ancient curse, they were doomed to perish should any mortal resist their call. And so, as Odysseus' ship vanished beyond the waves, the Sirens, defeated for the first time in eternity, cast themselves into the sea, their voices silenced forever. Fresh from the ordeal of the Sirens, Odysseus and his men faced yet another impossible choice: to navigate a strait where two deadly horrors lurked on either side. On one side was Charybdis, a monstrous whirlpool that swallowed entire ships into the abyss. On the other loomed Scylla, a six-headed beast lurking high on a rocky cliff, waiting to snatch men from passing ships with her long, snaking necks. Odysseus had no choice but to follow Circe's advice: avoid Charybdis at all costs. A confrontation with the whirlpool would doom them all. Instead, they would have to pass close to Scylla's lair, sacrificing a few men to her grasp rather than risk the entire ship being swallowed. As they rowed onward, Odysseus steeled himself. He did not tell his men what awaited them, knowing that panic would only lead to disaster. The ship hugged the cliffs, the roar of Charybdis' churning maw echoing behind them. Then, without warning, Scylla struck. From her perch above, the six-headed horror lunged, each of her heads snatching a man from the deck. Their screams rang out as they were hoisted into the air, their limbs thrashing as the monster devoured them alive. Odysseus could do nothing but watch as six of his strongest warriors were lost in an instant. His heart shattered, but there was no time to grieve. The ship sped forward, escaping before Scylla could claim more lives. Behind them, Charybdis roared, sucking the sea into her endless void. The men, now fewer in number, rowed in grim silence. They had survived, but at a terrible cost. This was the price of reaching Ithaca. Having survived Scylla and Charybdis, Odysseus and his men, weary and starving, drifted toward the island of Thrinacia, home to the sacred cattle of Helios, the sun god. The warning of Tiresias, spoken in the Underworld, rang fresh in Odysseus' mind. No matter what, do not touch the cattle, or doom will follow. But as they approached the island, a fierce storm erupted, forcing them to dock. The wind howled for days, trapping them on the shore. With their supplies running low, hunger gnawed at the men. Odysseus pleaded with them to resist temptation, to endure until the storm passed. But his words fell on deaf ears. One fateful night, as Odysseus lay in restless sleep, his men, led by Eurylochus, betrayed him. Desperation clouded their judgment, and they slaughtered the sacred cattle, roasting the meat over an open fire. The smell of burning flesh rose to the heavens, and the sun god Helios, furious at the sacrilege, demanded justice from Zeus himself. When Odysseus awoke, the damage was done. He wept in despair, knowing that divine retribution was imminent. As soon as the storm cleared and they set sail, Zeus fulfilled Helios' demand. A mighty thunderbolt struck the ship, shattering it into splinters. One by one, his men were swallowed by the raging sea, their cries lost to the waves. Odysseus alone survived. Clinging to the wreckage, he drifted across the vast ocean, alone and at the mercy of the gods. The tides carried him back toward the deadly Charybdis, where the monstrous whirlpool threatened to consume him. But by sheer will, he grasped the branches of a fig tree hanging above the abyss, and held on as his shattered raft was swallowed whole. Odysseus leapt onto the wreckage and paddled away, exhausted yet still alive. For 9 days and nights he floated helplessly on the waves, his fate unknown. Until finally he washed ashore on the remote island of Ogygia, the home of Calypso, the immortal nymph. Odysseus awoke, half buried in the soft sand, the salty waves lapping at his feet, his body battered by the sea, his spirit nearly broken. The island was lush and untouched by time, a paradise of towering trees, crystal-clear springs and blooming flowers. But this was no ordinary land. This was Ogygia, the domain of Calypso, the daughter of the Titan Atlas. Calypso found him and took him into her care, tending to his wounds, clothing him in fine linen and feeding him ambrosia and nectar fit for the gods. She fell deeply in love with him and offered him a choice: stay with her, become her immortal consort, and forget the pain of the world he left behind. For 7 years, Odysseus remained trapped on the island. Calypso showered him with affection, but his heart ached for Ithaca, for Penelope, for the life he had left behind. Each day, he stood upon the shore, gazing at the horizon, longing for home. He wept in secret, a warrior broken not by battle, but by time and longing. The gods, watching from Olympus, took pity on him. Athena, ever his protector, pleaded with Zeus to intervene. At last, Hermes, the messenger god, was sent to Ogygia, bearing an order from the king of the gods himself. Calypso must release Odysseus. Calypso was furious. She raged against the injustice of the gods, who allowed male deities to keep mortal lovers, but denied her the same right. Yet, she knew she could not defy Zeus. With a heavy heart, she agreed to let Odysseus go. She guided him to the shore and provided him with the tools to build a raft, stocking it with provisions for his journey. As he set sail once more, the winds carried him away from Ogygia, away from captivity and back toward destiny. But Poseidon, still vengeful, had not finished with him yet. A final storm awaited him before he could reach his true salvation. Odysseus had escaped Calypso's island, but Poseidon's fury remained. As he sailed alone on a fragile raft, the sea god unleashed a mighty storm, towering waves crashing around him. The wind roared, the sky darkened, and Odysseus was once more at the mercy of the gods. A massive wave shattered his raft, leaving him to struggle against the relentless ocean. It was then that Ino, a sea goddess, took pity on him. Rising from the depths, she offered him a magical veil, promising it would keep him from drowning. "Cast off your cloak," she said, "wrap this around you and swim for land." With no choice, Odysseus let the sea claim his broken raft and plunged into the waves. For 2 days and nights, he swam, battling exhaustion and hunger. At last, through the mist, he saw Scheria, the island of the Phaeacians. With the last of his strength, he crawled onto the shore, naked, battered and barely breathing. He had survived, but just barely. The next morning, Nausicaa, daughter of King Alcinous, came to the river with her handmaidens to wash clothes. There, she discovered the haggard, salt-crusted Odysseus. Though her attendants recoiled in fear, Athena filled Nausicaa's heart with courage. She offered him clothes and directions to the palace, showing kindness to the stranger before her. Upon reaching the grand hall of Alcinous and Queen Arete, Odysseus, ever cunning, concealed his true identity, appealing instead to their hospitality. The Phaeacians, known for aiding lost wanderers, welcomed him, granting him food and rest. That evening, as the court's bard Demodocus sang of the great heroes of Troy, Odysseus could not hold back his tears. Seeing this, Alcinous pressed him to reveal his name, and so, at last, he spoke. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. For 10 years I have wandered the seas, cursed by Poseidon, tested by gods and monsters alike. Moved by his trials, Alcinous declared that Odysseus would suffer no longer. The next day, a magnificent ship was prepared, stocked with gold and fine garments. As the Phaeacian sailors rowed through the night, Odysseus fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first true rest in years. By dawn, he reached the shores of Ithaca. The sailors, careful not to wake him, laid him beneath an olive tree and left their gifts beside him. Yet Poseidon, furious at the Phaeacians for aiding his enemy, struck their ship with a great wave, turning it to stone. Never again would they ferry mortals across the sea. As for Odysseus, he awoke at last on the soil of Ithaca. But his journey was not yet over, his kingdom was no longer his, and his greatest trial still lay ahead. While Odysseus fought gods and monsters across the sea, Ithaca had fallen into chaos, believing their king to be dead. A horde of greedy suitors had descended upon his palace, vying for Penelope's hand in marriage. They feasted upon Odysseus' stores, squandered his wealth, and disrespected his home, all while pressuring the queen to choose a new husband. But Penelope remained faithful. Using her cunning, she devised a trick. She promised to choose a suitor once she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus' father, Laertes. Each night, however, she unraveled the threads in secret, delaying the choice for years. Still, the suitors grew restless, their patience wearing thin. Meanwhile, Odysseus' son, Telemachus, had come of age. Though young and untested, he longed to find news of his father and reclaim his home. Guided by Athena, who had taken the form of Odysseus' old friend Mentor, he set sail for Pylos and Sparta, seeking word of his father. In Pylos he met the wise king Nestor, who recounted the fates of the other Greek heroes after Troy's fall. But of Odysseus, there was no news. From there, Telemachus traveled to Sparta, where he was received by Menelaus and Helen, the very cause of the Trojan War. The great king told him that, according to the seer Proteus, Odysseus was still alive, held captive on Calypso's island. Hope surged in Telemachus' heart, but while he was away, the suitors plotted against him. They laid an ambush upon his return, planning to kill him before he could reclaim his father's throne. Yet the gods had other plans. Athena, ever watchful, ensured that Telemachus evaded the trap and made it back to Ithaca in secret. But he was not alone. Odysseus had returned. Odysseus awoke beneath an olive tree, at last home after 20 years. But Ithaca was not as he had left it. The land was overrun with greedy suitors. To march into his palace unrecognized would mean certain death. Athena appeared before him, revealing the state of his kingdom. With a touch of her divine hand, she transformed him into an old beggar, his face weathered, his clothes tattered, his regal presence erased. No one would recognize him, not even Penelope. As he approached the palace, Odysseus saw a pile of dung by the gates, and lying atop it, his old hunting dog, Argos. Once a mighty and swift hound, Argos was now frail, covered in fleas, his body weak from neglect. Yet, as Odysseus neared, Argos' ears twitched, and his tail thumped weakly. Though Odysseus was disguised, his faithful companion knew him instantly. Fighting back tears, Odysseus turned away. To acknowledge Argos would risk exposing himself, but before he could take another step, Argos sighed, his duty fulfilled. He closed his eyes and passed away. Odysseus, hardened by war and suffering, shed a silent tear, knowing that his loyal friend had waited for him until the very end. His first stop was the hut of Eumaeus, his most loyal swineherd. Though the old servant did not recognize him, he welcomed the weary beggar, offering food and shelter. As they spoke, Odysseus carefully tested his loyalty. When Eumaeus cursed the suitors and wished for Odysseus' return, the king knew he still had true allies. It was there that Telemachus arrived, returning from his quest. Athena, unseen, instructed Odysseus to reveal himself. With a sweep of her hand, the beggar's disguise fell away, and in his place stood Odysseus, king of Ithaca. Telemachus, overcome, wept and embraced his father at last. Together, father and son devised their plan. The suitors were many, and they were few, but Odysseus had always relied on cunning over brute force. Disguised as a beggar, Odysseus entered his palace for the first time in 20 years. The once proud halls were now a den of excess, filled with the sound of laughter, drunken jeers, and the clatter of feasting. Then came Penelope's challenge. The queen, still refusing to marry any suitor, devised a final test. She would wed the man who could string Odysseus' great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads lined in a row. The suitors, filled with confidence, took their turns. One after another, they failed to string the bow, cursing and straining against the impossible task. No man among them could match the strength of the true king. Then the beggar stepped forward. Mocking laughter filled the hall. The suitors jeered at the idea that this frail old man could accomplish what they could not. But Penelope, intrigued, allowed him the attempt. Silence fell as Odysseus took the bow into his hands. With effortless grace, he bent and strung it, the bow humming with power. The suitors' laughter turned to uneasy murmurs. Taking his time, Odysseus nocked an arrow, took aim, and fired. The shaft sailed cleanly through all 12 axe heads, a perfect shot. Then he turned to the suitors. "You have defiled my house, consumed my wealth, and sought to steal my wife. Now, face your reckoning." With that, Odysseus loosed an arrow straight into the throat of Antinous, the most arrogant and cruel of the suitors. The hall erupted into chaos. The suitors scrambled for weapons, but they found none. Telemachus had secretly hidden them all. Now armed with bows and spears, Odysseus, Telemachus, Eumaeus, and Philoetius began the slaughter. One by one the suitors fell. Some attempted to fight back, but it was in vain. Athena herself intervened, deflecting their spears and ensuring Odysseus's victory. Soon the great hall was silent, filled only with the bodies of the slain. The suitors were no more. Odysseus's home was his once more. Even with the suitors dead, Penelope was not convinced. How could she be sure that this was truly her husband and not a trick of the gods? Clever as ever, she devised one final test. She commanded her servants to move their marriage bed, a bed that Odysseus himself had built. But Odysseus reacted with shock and anger. No man can move that bed. One of its posts is an olive tree rooted into the ground. I built it with my own hands, and only I know its secret. Hearing these words, Penelope finally knew the truth. Only the real Odysseus would know such a detail. Tears streamed down her face as she ran to embrace him. After 20 long years, husband and wife were reunited. With Ithaca restored, Odysseus turned his thoughts to his father, Laertes, who still lived in mourning. Traveling to the outskirts of the kingdom, he found the old man toiling in the fields, dressed in rags, his once mighty frame weakened by grief. Odysseus, testing his father, spoke in riddles at first, gauging whether Laertes still had hope. But the moment he revealed his true identity, the old king collapsed into his son's arms, overcome with joy. Yet, peace was still not assured. The families of the slain suitors seeking vengeance gathered an army to march upon Odysseus. But before battle could begin, Athena herself intervened, commanding both sides to lay down their weapons. The gods had decreed that bloodshed should end, and with her divine authority, peace was restored to Ithaca at last. Odysseus had completed his Odyssey. The long years of suffering were behind him, and at last, he stood among his family, his kingdom, and his people. The warrior had come home, and so the legend of Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, would be told for eternity.